Greetings, everybody, on this Sabbath day, April 18, 2015. And on God's calendar, it's the 28th day of the month of Nisan, or Abib. Tomorrow is most likely going to be the final day of this month. And tomorrow night, we expect to see the new moon. And so the month of Iyar, the second month, will begin tomorrow night, most likely. But today is the 28th of Nisan, and it is the 13th day of the Omer count. As you all know, we began counting the Omer, the second day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the day of the wave sheaf offering in ancient Israel. And we discussed the Omer count last week, which was the last day of unleavened bread, the 21st day of the month of Abib, or Nisan, which was the 7th day of unleavened bread and the great day of salvation and deliverance. Well, this is now the 6th day of the second week of the Omer count. And so from the Omer count meditation schedule put out by aish.com, a Jewish website, I want to go into the meaning of the date of the Omer count of this particular day. The second week is the week of Gevurah, which is the week of discipline and strength. This week we're working on all the elements that compose or affect discipline and strength of character. And of course, to enter God's kingdom, we must be overcomers, which means we must learn to discipline ourselves and develop strength of character. So this is the 6th day of the second week, or the 13th day of the Omer count. So it's the 6th day means this is the day of Yesod, which is foundation of obedience, faith, and Torah. And it has to do with bonding, because the foundation must be carefully laid and bonded together in order to stand firm and to support the building on top of it. I used to work years ago for my dad during the summers when I was in college and before in high school. And he was a builder of houses after he retired from the Navy. He began to invest in property and build homes, and my brother and I would both work with him and help him lay foundations for houses, to build the forms, to construct the forms, and then to pour the concrete into the forms. And we'd have these rods of steel to tamp down on the concrete to be sure it would go to the bottom of the form. To kind of juice it up by raising that rod up and down, and developing biceps and triceps and gluteus maximus muscles and everything else. That was pretty hard work. But we would do it to be sure that the water that would go into the concrete would saturate the concrete mix, and there'd be no dry spots left, because if the water didn't saturate it, and then the concrete didn't all coalesce properly, you could have a very shaky foundation with gaps and holes and weak spots. But you have to do the foundation properly, causing it to bond together to be a strong foundation. Well, that's what today is all about on the Omer count. It's building a strong foundation with discipline and bonding. The aish.com article says, for discipline to be effective, it must be coupled with commitment and bonding, both in disciplining yourself and others. There has to be a sense that the discipline is important for developing a stronger bond, for tying us all together. Not that I discipline you, but that we are doing it together for a mutual benefit, parent and child and teacher and student. Exercise for the day. Demonstrate to your child or student how discipline is an expression of intensifying your bond in commitment to each other. Intensifying our bond together through discipline and bonding, through laying a strong foundation. So we need to be working on that today and take advantage of learning how to discipline ourselves and building this strong, righteous character that God wants us to have. Gevurah, which I said means strength or discipline, it also means justice and restraint and awe. Awe in the sense of the fear of God, awe of God. The Aish.com says, after the miraculous exodus from Egypt, the Jewish people, or the Israelite people, spent 49 days preparing for the most awesome experience in human history, the giving of the Torah to the whole nation at Mount Sinai, from the very mouth of God himself. Just as the people's redemption from Egypt teaches us how to achieve inner freedom for our lives, so too this 49 days of preparation is called Sefirat HaOmer, or counting the Omer. And it is a time of intense character refinement and elevation. Building character with the building blocks of the scriptures, of the very characteristics of God's own character, his emanations or aspects that teach us how to act and to interact with one another. And these are, of course, the 7 characteristics of God listed in the Bible in various passages, beginning with loving kindness, Chesed, Gevurah, discipline, restraint, or self-control, and then Tiferet, beauty, peace, harmony, outgoing love, Netzach, victory, triumph, overcoming, endurance, Hod, glory, majesty, humility, Yesod, which is this week, bonding, laying a strong foundation that won't crumble or collapse, that will support everything built on top of it. And 7, the final characteristic, Malkut, kingship, sovereignty, rulership, being able not just to control yourself, but exercise your talents and abilities to control others and to bless a nation. So this is the week of Gevurah and the day of bonding. And we are in the midst of the Omer count, and as we all know, the Passover season is a time when many trials come upon God's people. And it seems like this is a parallel to the scriptures, because of course ancient Israel had all their trials in Egypt before they were set free. They had the 10 plagues that came upon the Egyptians. And I believe it's the first 4 of those plagues also affected the Israelites until they began to really discern the fact they had to separate from the Egyptians. They had to be different. They were being redeemed, and in the process of coming out of Egypt, they had to begin to change their thinking change their patterns of thought, their habitual thinking, and no longer see themselves as slaves that had to conform to the Egyptian way of doing things. They had to begin to see themselves as free men, as sons of liberty, sons of God, and servants of God. So they had to put away the Egyptian formulas and forms and ideals and thinking patterns and begin to develop and grow and intensify the thinking patterns of the Scriptures, of God's way, God's truth, God's Torah, His law and His commandments. And even after they left Egypt, they still had trials and tests. They were wandering in the desert, lacking food, lacking water. And so God taught them to depend on Him and look to Him. And He gave them water from the rock that followed them, which was Christ. He gave them water from the rocks in the desert, where Moses smote the rock and the water poured forth at Mount Sinai. And God gave them food in the desert, manna, which was angels' food, a miracle from heaven. And God taught them to learn to look to Him and depend upon Him. But you know, that generation did not listen very well. And they kept hankering back for the leeks and the onions and the food of Egypt, the blessings of Egypt. And they kind of despised this manna after a while, and they wanted flesh to eat. So God sent them quail. And they were so hungry for the quail, they just grabbed it and began to eat it raw. And a great plague came upon them because of their sinful disobedience. Well, they had to go through trials and tests in the desert to learn to shed off Egypt and the Egyptian cultural influences and to become like God wanted them to be, a holy, righteous nation, His special treasure. As God said in Exodus chapter 19, at the foot of Mount Sinai, He told them what their purpose in life was, why He had made them into a nation. He said in verse 5, "Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, my special laws, the Torah, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people on the earth. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests, teachers, spiritual leaders, and a holy nation, a nation that is set apart for special service." These are the words God told Moses that you shall speak to the children of Israel. And we are now called as Christians to be that holy nation, a spiritual nation. As Peter tells us in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 9, he says to the church, "But you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, His own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of Him, of Almighty God, Jehovah, Yahweh Elohim, that you may proclaim the praises of Him who called you out of the darkness of this world into His marvelous light." He says, "You once were not a people, But now you are the people of God, the nation of God, the chosen generation, the royal priesthood of God. You had not obtained mercy, but now you have obtained mercy, because God has forgiven us our sins and set us apart to serve him. So as Peter says in verse 11, "Beloved, I beg you, as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts, which war against the soul, having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that whenever they speak against you as if you were an evildoer, they may, by your good works, which they observe and see, actually glorify God in the day of visitation, when he visits them and they open their eyes and they see the truth." So we are a holy nation, a royal priesthood, in training, in development, as we walk the Omer path, as we march toward Mount Sinai, or Mount Zion in our case. And we need to be prepared and count the Omer faithfully, because it is a process of building character that's laid out for us. And we started that on the second day of Passover, Nisan or Abib 16. And there's some controversy over that, because the Karaites don't do it that way. They wait till the Sabbath day during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the regular weekly Sabbath, and then they start to count on the day after that. But on the stone edition of the Chumash, a Jewish commentary on the books of the Torah and the Haftarah, the Law and the Prophets, in Leviticus chapter 23, page 685, it talks about the Omer count. And the Chumash says, verse 11, "On the morrow of the day," where God says, "You shall begin or bring a wave sheaf offering on the morrow after the Sabbath." Literally it means on the morrow of the rest day, i.e., the morrow of the first day of Pesach, or Passover, which is called a rest day, or a Sabbath, because ordinary work is forbidden. Although the word Shabbat ordinarily refers to the weekly Sabbath day, this cannot be the case here, because the verse does not specify which of the 52 weekly Shabbats is meant. It just says in the Hebrew, Ha-Shabbat, the Sabbath. It's a special one. And it doesn't specify which one of 52 weekly Sabbaths is meant. So how do you know it's the one during the days of unleavened bread? The answer is you don't know that, because it's not true. The Sabbath under question here is the first Sabbath of the days of unleavened bread, Nisan 15, which is an annual Shabbat, or Sabbath day. The Chumash goes on and says, this term, Shabbat, became one of the major points of controversy between the sages, the Pharisees, and the heretical Boethusians. The Boethusians were the Sadducees, a high-up family amongst the Sadducean priests. the Boethusians. They interpreted the term Shabbat literally as referring to the weekly Sabbath, thus claiming that the Omer count has to be brought on a Sunday. And therefore they count Sundays, 7 Sundays, until they come to Pentecost on a Sunday every year. Well, that is contrary to Orthodox Judaism. That is contrary to the law of the Torah. And I'm going to give you the evidence to back that up today. Because I think we need to know that we're doing it right. And others who are keeping Pentecost on Sunday and counting from Sunday are doing it wrong. And we need to review this every year so we don't become misled by false teachers. And we are living in an age of deception, and false teachers are everywhere today. But in the commentary on the Old Testament by Keel and Delitzsch, he goes into this subject and on the commentary on Leviticus chapter 23. This is page 612 of this volume 1 of the commentary. And he points out here on page 613, they were to bring a sheaf of the first fruits of their harvest to the priest, that he might wave it before Jehovah on the day after the Sabbath, that is, after the first day of Matzot. According to Josephus and Philo, it was a sheaf of barley. That this is not expressly commanded, because it would be taken for granted in Canaan, where the harvest always began with the barley in the springtime. In the warmer parts of Palestine, the barley ripens about the middle of April and is reaped in April or the beginning of May, whereas the wheat opens 2 or 3 weeks later in the year. The priest was to wave the barley sheaf before Jehovah to present it symbolically before God by the ceremony of waving, without burning it, any of it, upon the altar. Then he discusses later on in this page the morrow after the Sabbath, the day we start to count the Omer from. It says the morrow after the Sabbath signifies the next day after the first day of the Feast of Matzot, or unleavened bread, i.e., the 16th day of Nisan, or Abib. Not the day of the Sabbath, which fell during the 7 days Feast of Matzot. Not that day. That's what the Karaites claim. That's what the Sadducees did. But they were heretics. Still less, he says, the 22nd day of Nisan, or the day after the conclusion of the 7-day festival. The view advocated by the Boethusians, he says, is refuted not only by Joshua chapter 5 and verse 11, but by the definite article used, ha-Shabbat. Ha is the article which means the Sabbath. This term points back to one of the feast days already mentioned in Leviticus 23, and still more decisively by the circumstance that according to verse 15, the 7 weeks at the close of which the Feast of Pentecost was to be kept were to be reckoned from this particular Sabbath, which is the first day of unleavened bread, Nisan 15. The day after that's when we begin counting, the 16th of Nisan. If the Sabbath were not fixed, but if it might fall upon any of the 7 days of unleavened bread, like the Karaites say, or the Boethusians said, that if that were to happen, then as many as 5 or 6 days after the Passover might pass before waving the wave sheaf, which disconnects it from the Passover by a varying number of days every year. That would cause the Feast of the Passover no longer to be in the fundamental position as the head of the feast days. It would be forced out of that position. Pentecost would no longer rely on Passover, but on a weekly Sabbath day for its computation, which forces Passover out of its preeminent position. Which it occupies in the sequence of the festivals of God. So the commentary goes on, page 614. The Sabbath does not mean the 7th day of the week, but the day of rest. Although the weekly Sabbath was always the 7th or last day of the week, hence not only the 7th day of the week, but the day of atonement also. The 10th day of the 7th month is called Shabbat, and Shabbat, Shabbaton. It is a day of rest on which no laborious work was to be performed. So also the first day of the Feast of Matzot is called Shabbat, here in Leviticus 23, irrespective of the day of the week upon which it fell. And the morrow after the Shabbat is equivalent to the morrow after the Passover, as it says in Joshua chapter 5 and verse 11. There it's called the morrow of the Passover. There, Passover signifies the day at the beginning of which the Passover meal was held. The Passover meal was held on Nisan 15, after the lambs were slain on Nisan 14 in the afternoon. The Passover meal, the Seder, was eaten on the 15th of Nisan, beginning after sunset. So that is the day of the Passover alluded to in Joshua 5, verse 11. That on the morrow, or the day after that Passover, which was therefore the 16th of Nisan, they waved the wave sheaf offering. Then they could partake of the harvest. as it says they did in the days of Joshua at that passage, Joshua 5:11 and 12. They give more evidence here to prove that, but I don't want to go into all the other passages, or I'd take up the whole Bible study. You can read my articles on Pentecost and counting the Pentecost for more information. On this subject. But now going over to the book of Joshua in volume 2 of the commentary. Joshua 5:10 through 14, volume 2, page 44. And here the commentary says, they're talking about this wave sheaf offering and the Passover that was given or taken by the Israelites at Gilgal when they crossed into the Holy Land under Joshua. When the whole nation had been received again into the covenant with the Lord by circumcision, which was done at that time, they kept the Passover, which had no doubt been suspended from the time they left Sinai. On the 14th day of the month, in the evening, according to the law, they kept the Passover, which means the beginning part of Nisan 15, the holy day. The next day, i.e. on the 16th, or the day after the first feast day, they ate unleavened bread and parched corn. Now this means they ate of the produce of the land on the 16th day of Nisan. However, they were forbidden to eat any of the produce of the land until they offered the wave sheaf offering. So that means they had to offer the wave sheaf offering that day on the 16th of Nisan. Then they could eat of the produce of the land. That is the corn grown in the land of Canaan, as the manna ceased to fall from heaven on the following day. From that day forward, the manna stopped coming, and they had to eat the produce of the land from that day forward. The morrow after the Sabbath, they say, the editors, Keel and Delish, the morrow after the Sabbath, after the Passover, as it says here in Joshua 5, verse 11, is used in Numbers 33, verse 3, for the 15th day of Nisan. But here it must be understood as signifying the 16th day, because the produce of the land of which they ate, not only on that day, but according to verse 12, throughout that year, cannot mean the corn from the previous year, but the produce of that same year, i.e. the new corn. And according to Leviticus chapter 23, verse 11, the presentation of the Omer was to take place on the day after the Sabbath, i.e. the first day of the Feast of Matzot, or unleavened bread, which was kept as a Sabbath, or it had to be done on the 16th day of Nisan, as the 7-day feast of Matzot commenced on the 15th day of Nisan. So on the morrow after the Passover is the same thing as on the morrow after the Sabbath. It's the Passover Sabbath of that first Passover, that first day of the Passover week. That's what the commentary has to say. And in the Temple by Ministry by Alfred Edersheim, he also tells us about the sheaf of the first fruits and the counting to Pentecost. On page 203, at the bottom, there's a section called The Morrow After the Sabbath. And Edersheim writes, the expression, the morrow after the Sabbath, Leviticus 23, verse 11, has sometimes been misinterpreted, or misunderstood rather, as implying that the presentation of the so-called first fruit, or first sheaf, was to be always made on the day following the weekly Sabbath day of the Passover week. This view was adopted by the Boethusians and the Sadducees in the time of Christ, and by the Karaite Jews and certain modern interpreters after that. But this rests on a misinterpretation of the word Sabbath, Edersheim says. As in analogous allusions to other feasts in the same chapter, Leviticus 23, it means not the weekly Sabbath, but the day of the festival. The testimony of Josephus, of Philo, and of Jewish tradition leaves no room to doubt that this means the 15th day of Nisan, the first day of Passover, the holy day, no matter what day of the week it fell on. Already, he says, on the 14th of Nisan, the spot where the first sheaf was to be reaped had been marked out by delegates from the Sanhedrin by tying together bundles of barley in the field. Then on the evening of the 15th of Nisan, the community would go out to that barley field, even if it were a Sabbath day, a weekly Sabbath day, just as the sun was down, setting. And three men would take a sickle and go into the field. And they would say to the bystanders watching this event, "Has the sun gone down? With this sickle into this basket on the Sabbath." And lastly, they would ask the bystanders, "Shall I reap?" 3 times each phrase. And having been answered in the affirmative, they would cut down the barley for the wave sheaf offering. Now that is what Edersheim says about it. But you know, it's interesting that we have other evidence about this timing of the Omer count. There is evidence in the New Testament on this subject. And more evidence from the Old Testament. I wrote an article a few years ago on the New Testament proof of Pentecost. I don't know how many people have read that article, but I go into the various proofs of the counting to Pentecost, and how to count, what day to count from, because the Worldwide Church of God got all mixed up. And they flip-flopped backward and forward like a fish out of water. Back in the 1930s, Herbert Armstrong began keeping God's holy days, and he began by keeping Pentecost on Sivan 6, like the Jews do today, based upon the modern Jewish calendar. Then after 3 or 4 years, he got away from that and began keeping it on a Monday every year, counting like the Sadducees counted from the weekly Sabbath day during Passover week. But he didn't count from Sunday by including Sunday. He counted away from Sunday, beginning with Monday. So his 7 weeks ended up on a Monday. The 50th day ended up on a Monday, Pentecost. For decades he kept a Monday Pentecost, until finally in 1974 it was pointed out to him by certain scholars that the Jewish method of counting was not exclusive or inclusive. And when you count from a day, you count beginning with that day. So if you count from Sunday, you count beginning with Sunday. And they argued over this, and Herbert Armstrong finally relented and changed it to Sunday. So Worldwide Church of God began keeping a Sunday Pentecost. Well, you know, they just never could get it right, again, because they strayed from the truth. Pentecost should not have been counted from the weekly Sunday, but from the day after Passover, like the Jews have always done. I want to give you some of the source material to prove that now. And first we go to Luke chapter 6, verses 1 through 2, in the New Testament. Luke writes, "Now it happened on the second Sabbath after the first, that he went through the grain fields," meaning Christ, "and his disciples plucked the heads of grain from the wheat fields and ate them, rubbing them in their hands. And some of the Pharisees said to them, 'Why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath day?'" Luke 6, 1 through 2. Notice they accused the disciples of harvesting grain and eating it on the weekly Sabbath. And they said, that's not kosher. That's not allowed in the law. You can't harvest on the Sabbath day. Matthew records the same event. Matthew 12, verse 1. In this passage, the simple word Sabbath is used, showing that this is a normal weekly Sabbath day, not an annual holy day. That same day, they entered a local synagogue. Matthew 12, verse 9. And Christ healed a man on that weekly Sabbath day. He healed a man. And this was on a weekly Sabbath day. The Jews didn't like that either. Well, going back to Luke chapter 6, the verse quoted there, in the Greek-English interlinear, it says, "And it happened on the second chief Sabbath." End of quote. The Greek expression here is sabbaton deuteroproton. It means literally Sabbath the second chief, or Sabbath the second first, chief or first, or in modern English, the second first or chief Sabbath, the second one. What's that mean? It means of the year, or the second one in a row, number 2. Now what does that mean? What is the solution to this puzzle, this puzzling expression, sabbaton deuteroproton? Well, actually, during the Passover and days of unleavened bread, the Jews said we actually had 3 chief Sabbath days. The first day of unleavened bread, the weekly Sabbath that falls in the days of unleavened bread, and the last day of unleavened bread. They're all 3 Sabbath days. So the first day of unleavened bread is Nisan 15, the high holy day of Passover. Then the weekly Sabbath day occurs during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And the final day of unleavened bread then would be the 3rd chief Sabbath. Both the first day and the last day of unleavened bread are annual Sabbath days. But the one in the middle is a weekly Sabbath day. But they're all Sabbath days. So now take another look at this passage in Luke. It is clear that the Sabbath mentioned here must have been a Sabbath during the week of unleavened bread, or Passover week. At no other festival of God during the year are there 2 or 3 chief Sabbaths. Pentecost is a festival. It's just one day. Feast of Tabernacles is 7 days, but only the first day is a Sabbath day. Or the second day during the feast could be a Sabbath day, but not 3. However, remember, this particular deuteroproton was in the spring, and the disciples are going through the grain field harvesting grain. That pinpoints this festival as being in the spring or Passover time, when the barley and the wheat begins to ripen. Could not have been the Feast of Tabernacles. That's after the harvest, the fall harvest. This had to be the spring harvest. Deuteroproton. And what did the disciples do on this harvest day in the spring? They plucked grain and they ate it. Let's go back to Leviticus chapter 23 now and see what God says about plucking grain and when you can pluck it and eat it. Verses 10 through 11. God says, "When you come to the land of Israel, which I will give you, and reap its harvest, then you shall bring a sheaf for the first fruits of your harvest to the priest. And you shall wave the sheaf before Jehovah to be accepted on your behalf as a nation. On the day after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it." That's the famous wave sheaf offering. Notice, they had to wave it on the day after the Sabbath. Now, the thing is, Leviticus 23 now, verses 14 through 15, explains a vital element here. God said to Israel, "You shall not eat either bread or parched grain, nor fresh grain, until the selfsame day that you brought the wave sheaf offering to your God. It shall be a statute forever, throughout your generations, in all your dwellings. And then you shall count for yourselves from that day after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering." So let's back up and take another look at this. Mathematically, are we challenged? Can we get this clearly? Can we pay attention and listen? One, the first Sabbath of the year, the annual Sabbath, during the feast time is Nisan 15, the Passover Sabbath. Then, during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, you have the weekly Sabbath. And then at the end of the feast, you have the last day of unleavened bread, the seventh day, which is also a Sabbath. Now, Deuteroproton is the name of the Sabbath, the second chief Sabbath, when the disciples are going through the grain fields eating grain. Now, the second chief Sabbath in the springtime would have to be the weekly Sabbath during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The Sabbath after the Passover Sabbath, the second Sabbath. But Leviticus says you cannot eat of the grain of the field until the wave sheaf offering, which is offered the day after the Sabbath. So if the Karaites were right and the Sadducees were right, then that Sabbath they would have been breaking two laws, according to the Jews. They would have been partaking of the fruits of the harvest before the wave sheaf offering. If that offering was on Sunday, the next day, it would have been in violation of the Torah, if that was the true interpretation, as well as harvesting grain on a regular Sabbath day, working on the Sabbath. There'd be two violations. One violating God's law about the harvest. So they were doing this, and the Pharisees did not correct them or say they were wrong by partaking of the harvest before the first fruits. They didn't say that. Why? Because the first fruits wave sheaf offering was done the day after Passover on Nisan 16. So they'd already had the wave sheaf offering that year when the disciples were out on the Sabbath day eating parched corn. They weren't violating any law as to the harvest. And that proves, the Pharisees didn't challenge them, that proves the harvest had already been, the wave sheaf had already been waved before the Lord, and the harvest could be partaken of by that weekly Sabbath day. So that proves the Karaites are wrong. And the Sadducees were wrong. The Malthusians were wrong. The Jews were right. The Orthodox Jews, the Pharisees, were right. Traditional Judaism is right. Herbert Armstrong was wrong. He picked the wrong horse to win the race. He picked a donkey instead of a thoroughbred. He got it all mixed up, balled up, and confused, and therefore led thousands of people astray. He didn't understand. He went off into the boondocks. So, let's take a look at what the scriptures also say on this subject. Number one, what did Christ say about the Sadducees and the Boethusians, the ones who counted from the weekly Sabbath day? What did Christ, the Messiah, have to say about them? Turn to Matthew 22 and verse 29. He said to them in general, he said, "You are mistaken, not knowing the Scriptures, nor the power of God." Now there he was specifically talking about the resurrection. And these Sadducees denied the resurrection, as well as other errors. And Christ said to them, "You are mistaken. You don't know the Scriptures." Well, if they didn't know the Scriptures, then how could they possibly interpret them correctly? In any disagreement, why would you follow people that Christ said don't know the Scriptures? Answer me that. Or, here's point number two. The Apostle Paul said in Acts 23 and verse 6, "I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee." He was not a Sadducee. He was a Pharisee. Acts 26, verse 5. Paul said, "According to the strictest sect of our religion, the Jewish religion, I lived a Pharisee." And in Philippians chapter 3 and verse 5, Paul said to the Philippians, "I am indeed a Jew, brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, taught according to the strictness of our father's law." Acts 22 verse 3. He said that in the city of Jerusalem, before the Jews, I should say. And he told his Jewish brethren, "I am also a Jew, taught according to the strictness of our fathers, at the feet of Gamaliel, a leading Pharisee rabbi." And then to the Philippians 3 verse 5, he said to them that he was concerning the law of Pharisee, not a Sadducee. And he said, concerning the righteousness which is of the law, blameless or perfect. Verse 6, Philippians 3 verse 6. What does this tell us, brethren? That the Pharisees interpreted the law of counting the Omer and Pentecost correctly. Paul lived his life as a Pharisee and became a Christian, following Christ, and still observed the law and interpreted as the Pharisees. He said this long after he'd been preaching the gospel, years later. He said, "I am a Pharisee, not I was a Pharisee." And then finally, 3. Christ himself said in Matthew 23, verses 2 through 3, that the Pharisees, he said, sit in Moses' seat. The scribes and the Pharisees, they sit in Moses' seat, not the Sadducees. "Therefore, whatsoever they tell you to observe, like counting the Omer from Nisan 16, that you should observe and do. But don't do according to their works," their hypocritical deeds and additions to the law. "For they say and do not," he said. So let me make this plain. Jesus Christ, Yeshua the Messiah, never once found fault or criticized the Pharisees on how they counted Pentecost. Oh, he found a lot of faults in the Pharisees. In Matthew chapter 23, he said, "Woe unto them," and called them snakes and blind guides and leaders of the blind. But he also said they sat in Moses' seat, and to observe what they said and taught according to the law of Moses. In Matthew 23, verses 2 through 3. And nowhere in the New Testament does he or Peter or James or John or Paul or Jude ever criticize the Pharisees counting to Pentecost. Instead, Paul confirmed it, but said he was a Pharisee and he was taught the law of God blamelessly, without fault. So what do we find here then in Matthew and 12 and Luke chapter 6 about Deuteroproton and the second chief Sabbath after the first? The disciples of Christ were there in the fields plucking grain and eating the grain. And this was on a weekly Sabbath during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So according to the Karaites and the Sadducees, they were breaking the law because the wave sheaf offering wouldn't be until the next day. And yet the Pharisees did not correct them, and Christ did not correct them. So apparently in the eyes of the Pharisees, in the eyes of Christ, eating and harvesting before the weekly Sabbath was all right, which means they had to be counting to Pentecost from the day after Nisan 15, the beginning of the feast. The first Sabbath, chief Sabbath. Then that was the day of the morrow of which they were to wave the wave sheaf offering and begin counting. And that's why today we are on the 13th day of the Omer count, not a different count. Okay. If you check the Matthew Henry commentary on this passage in Luke chapter 6, it says this story here has a date, which we had not in the other evangelists. It was on the second Sabbath after the first. That is, as Dr. Whitby thinks, is pretty clear. The first Sabbath after the second day of unleavened bread is what is meant. And which day they reckoned the 7 weeks to the feast and Pentecost. The first of which they called Sabbaton, Deuteroproton. The second, Deuteron, and so on. Duke's Annotated Bible says these 6 words, the second Sabbath after the first, are only from one Greek word, deuteroprotos, the second first Sabbath. The ordinary weekly Sabbath following the special Sabbath that began the Feast of Unleavened Bread, regardless of what day of the week it fell upon. Deuteroproton, the second Sabbath that fell during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Adam Clarke's commentary, which is one I've had for years, 3-volume set, also has Luke chapter 6, and it explains about the word deuteroproton. Says it should say the first Sabbath after the second day of Passover. On the 14th day of Nisan, the Passover was killed. next day, the 15th day, was the first day of unleavened bread, the Sabbath day. The day following, the 16th day of Nisan, the wave sheaf was offered, pursuant to the law, on the morrow after that Sabbath, the annual Sabbath. So the Sabbath here in Luke 6 is not the seventh day of the week, rather the Sabbath that we count from is the first day of unleavened bread. But the next Sabbath is Deuteroproton, the second chief Sabbath. That's the Sabbath that falls during the days of unleavened bread. The Sabbath, then, on which the disciples plucked the ears of corn, was the first Sabbath after that second day, or rather, the first Sabbath, weekly Sabbath, during the days of unleavened bread. The first day being Nisan 14, the day of the Passover sacrifice. The second day, which was the first Sabbath day, was Nisan 15, the annual Sabbath day of Passover. Dr. Lightfoot has demonstrably proved this to be the meaning of Sabbaton Deuteroproton. And from him, F. Lamy and Dr. Whitby have so explained it. This Sabbath day that the disciples plucked the ears of corn could not fall before the Passover, because until the second day of the feast, no Jew might eat either bread or parched corn or green ears. So said the law. Leviticus chapter 23 and verse 14. Adam Clark then makes the point I made earlier, and he says, had the disciples gathered these ears of corn on any Sabbath before the Passover, or that is, before the wave sheaf offering, they would have broken 2 laws instead of 1. And for the breach of these 2 laws, they would infallibly have been accused by the Pharisees, whereas they only broke 1 law in the Pharisees' sight, the law of harvesting on a weekly Sabbath day. Because the Pharisees said that Nisan 16 was the day of the wave sheaf offering. So that's Adam Clark's commentary, volume 3, page 404. Now, as another piece of evidence to prove that we are counting correctly, and counting the Omer and all these other churches and church groups seemingly don't care. They're not really willing to dig in and prove all things, to dig up nuggets of truth and really search for the truth. They're just going to take what comes to them and fly with it. Trouble is, it won't fly, which means they're going to have a crash landing. They're in a plane where the pilot has locked himself in the cockpit and he's suicidal. And unless they get out of the plane or parachute out, they're going to crash along with all the other passengers in that plane who are suicidal or taking for granted that their pilot or minister is teaching them the truth. And he's been lying to them, teaching falsehoods in pride and arrogance and self-importance. You know, brethren, let's just look at the facts. Look at the scriptures. in 250 BC, Ptolemy Philadelphus, the reigning king of Egypt, consulted the Jews and asked them to send leading Jewish scholars and rabbis to translate the Hebrew Torah and scriptures into Egyptian, into Greek, the Greek language. And so the rabbis picked 70 or 72 men to go to Alexandria, Egypt, where they were cloistered on an island, to translate the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. And it's called the Septuagint, because Septuagint means 70. And there were 70 scholars, or 72, involved in this project. And they made a spectacular translation into the Greek, which became the Bible, the Torah of the Greek-speaking world, and all Greek-speaking Jews. And they honored it and they respected it. Now we have copies of the Septuagint that goes back to that translation, which was made, number one, before there was a Sadducee or a Pharisee as such. They didn't come into existence until the time of Antiochus Epiphanes and the Maccabees, about 166, 164 BC. But the Septuagint was translated 250 years before Christ, about 80 years earlier, before the Sadducees and Pharisees formed into religious bodies. So this translation is free from corruption of the kind or opinion. It is the orthodox official translation of the Jewish scriptures of that time, 250 years before Christ. Now turn to Leviticus chapter 23. Verses 4 through 11. It says, "These are the festivals of the Lord, holy set days, which you shall proclaim in their set times. In the first month and the 14th day of the month, between the two evenings, is the Passover of the Lord. And on the 15th day of this month begins the festival of unleavened bread for the Lord. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. Now the first day shall be a holy set day for you. You shall do no sacrificial service, but offer whole burnt offerings to the Lord 7 days. And the 7th day shall be a holy set day for you. You should do no sacrificial service. Moreover, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and thou shalt say to them, When you come into this land which I give you, and are about to reap the harvest thereof, you shall bring a sheaf as the first fruits of your harvest to the priest, and he shall offer up the sheaf before the Lord, to be accepted for you on the morrow of, or after the first day. The people shall offer this up. So the wave sheaf offering was to be offered up on the morrow of what? The first day. The first day of what? The first day of the Feast of Passover. The first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That's the first day. It's not the weekly Sabbath day. The first day is the first day of the feast. And the wave sheaf offering here is to be waved before the Lord on the morrow of what? The first day. That's the Septuagint. 250 years before Christ. 80 years before the first Pharisee or the first Sadducee. Those parties arose during the days of the Maccabees, after the invasion of Israel by Antiochus Epiphanes. So I think we've got it. In fact, I know we've got it correct. We have it right, brethren. Let's be thankful to God and rejoice that He has given us this precious nuggets of truth, which enables us to obey His law and keep His commandments, to count properly, not to go off into never land or count in ignorance or abysmally following heretics, but to count like the Orthodox Jews always have, like Christ and Paul and the apostles counted, like the Septuagint says we should count, from the day after the first day of Passover. It's so simple. How could men go astray and miss this? Well, I'd say it's got to be said, brethren, because they were far from God, because they weren't seeking the truth of God with their whole heart. They weren't studying and humbling themselves before the throne of God. They were going astray because they had their heart set on other things, not on serving God. Now, I am talking about this today for several reasons. One is because we are in the midst of the Omer count, and we are counting correctly. Praise God. Other churches don't understand this truth. And they are not even, number one, most of them are not even counting the Omer. And those few that might, they're doing it the wrong way, following the wrong teachers, heretics. Now, this past week I got an email from D. Lacey. They published what's called the Kodesh Report. This is the original Kodesh newsletter, April 2015, issue 57. And this is the Feast of Yahweh, or Yahweh, the Spring Festival Edition, the Omer and Feast of First Fruits. He has an index, the Omer count, page 1, and then on page 2, proof on how to count. And he sent me an email, Mr. Lacey did, asking permission to run my article on Luke 6 and counting Pentecost, the New Testament proof. And so I turned to page 2, and here is my article. Pentecost, New Testament, proof on how to count. And he's got it here word for word. In my opening subhead it says, the controversy still rages on how to count Pentecost. Is it counted from a weekly Sabbath during the days of unleavened bread? Or should it be counted from the day after the Passover holy days, the first day of unleavened bread? Here is amazing New Testament evidence on this continuing dispute. So he's got the whole article the way I originally wrote it, explaining about Deuteroproton, the Leviticus legislation, the wave sheaf offering, what it was and when it was. What do you mean Sabbath? A new look at Luke 6. Evidence from 250 BC and the Septuagint. Then a little criticism of Herbert Armstrong's lack of scholarship, the way he misquoted the Mishnah and took it out of context to make it look like the Mishnah was supporting the Sadducees and the Karaites, and it wasn't. It was condemning them, lifting them up as a heretic and saying, we do this because of those heretics. But Herbert just got it wrong. So I asked in that article, toward the end, again, I must wonder why Herbert Armstrong took the passage in the Mishnah and quoted it totally out of context. Why indeed? And I suggest that those who cling to the teachings of Herbert Armstrong, particularly on the doctrine regarding the counting of Pentecost and the wave sheaf offering, ought to reconsider their ways. Whom do you trust? Almighty God and His plain word, or a man who apparently either was very confused or overly authoritative and yet lacking in true, honest scholarship? Where do we stand? God says, Solomon wrote in the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon said, fear God and keep His commandments. This is the whole man, or the whole duty of man. Keep His commandments means do what He says. And that includes count Pentecost the way He says to count it. Don't go off the deep end. Don't follow men into oblivion. But God says in Leviticus chapter 23, verse 15, and you shall count for yourselves from the day after the Sabbath, the first high holy day, from the day you brought the wave sheaf offering, 7 weeks, or rest periods, shall be completed. Count 50 days to the end of the 7th week. And in Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 9, God says to each one of us, you shall count 7 weeks for yourself. This is a journey of counting daily. You shall count 7 weeks for yourself. Begin to count the 7 weeks from the time you begin to put the sickle to the grain. And that is the 16th of Nisan. And count 7 weeks. 7 periods of 7. And doing that this year, Nisan 15, the holy day, fell on a Sunday. So Nisan 16, the day we count from, fell on a Monday. This year, Pentecost will occur and be celebrated on a Monday. 7 weeks brings us to a Sunday. 49 days. Then the 50th day is Pentecost, which will be a Monday. Now the Catholic Church has that Sunday is Whit Sunday, or their Pentecost. And all those churches who count from Sunday this year are going to wind up keeping their Pentecost on the pagan Whit Sunday of the Catholics, counted from Easter Sunday. Do you want to be a pagan? Do you want to be like the pagans and have God's condemnation? In Ezekiel chapter 8, God says what he thinks of pagan worship. Ezekiel was taken by God up to the temple and had visions of the Lord in Jerusalem. And he saw the image of jealousy there in God's temple, a pagan image, an idol. And God said to him, verse 6, Son of man, do you see what they are doing? The great abominations that the house of Israel commits here to make me go far away from my own sanctuary. Now turn again and you'll see even greater abominations. And then he saw creeping things and abominable beasts and idols in the house of Israel, the house of the Lord. And then he saw women weeping openly for Tammuz, celebrating Easter. And they saw men with their backs toward the temple of the Lord and their faces toward the east, worshiping the rising sun toward the east. Easter sunrise services. And God calls all these things abominations. And the Catholic Whit Sunday is a festival of the pagan goddess Maya, the goddess of fertility. Pagan, an abomination in God's sight. So brethren, let's do like Jude said. Let's contend earnestly with all of our strength for the faith once delivered to the saints, and having done all, to stand before the Lord our God in garments, pure garments of righteousness and obedience. Thank God for his truth. Amen.